To start us off, we have two presenters from the University of Tampa, and they will be presenting documentary abroad, student research, on-set, and behind the scenes.
Hello everyone, so as he just said, I'm Lisa.
I'm Zane.
And we are from the University of Tampa, and last June we took a travel course to Cuenca, Ecuador to make a documentary. And this documentary is about a local nonprofit organization called FCT. So for those of you who don't know, Ecuador is located in South America, and it may look like a tiny little speck, but Ecuador is actually the size of Colorado with immense diversity in its wildlife and culture.
All right. So yeah, as we mentioned, we're making a documentary on a non-profit organization. The organization we're given was Cordial Tropical. We used to start calling it FCT for short. And this organization basically was a non-profit organization locally based in Cuenca. And their goal was to conserve rainforests in the Andean region. And basically how they worked as being such a small unit, instead of going out there and working with mass people, they went for the route of working and building relationships with the landowners and kind of educating them on how to conserve the rainforest. So they're all about personal relationships and building friendships with the people of the land, trying to educate them on how to conserve the rainforest.
So Cuenca is where FCT is based from, but they travel to this Sangay National Park pretty much every day, at least some of the people, and they do all of their work from National Sangay to help conserve it. And like Zane said, they work with the landowners who, even though it's a national park, they still live in here, and it's where they make their homes.
Yeah, so one of the main problems that they were having in Sangay Park was that the landowners who had been there for generations are just slowly cutting back and back into the forest up the mountain. This obviously causing a lot of problems, erosion, deforestation, never a good thing for such a diverse rainforest. And the reason why they were doing it was for pastures, so they could have more cattle, make more money. So basically FCT's job was to try and educate them and show them there's other ways to, for them to fund themselves and economically, for them to survive without cutting into the rainforest.
Another important factor in the national park was these bears called the Andean bears, and FCT spends a lot of time promoting how they're becoming endangered and trying to save them. And they're known as an indicated species, and they're only found in this park, so that's why they're so special and rare.
Cool. So basically when we got there, we knew very little about the organization that we were going to work on. And there's our group there up in the national park. One of the main problems I guess we were having when we first started our research on the organization was that they had so many different projects, so many different little things they were doing to protect the rainforest. And we had a goal in mind of making a 10-minute documentary, the best we could, to kind of tell their story. And they were throwing a bunch of ideas at us. They were throwing a bunch of different people to us we could get in contact to, which was great. But it also presented us with quite a challenge to kind of narrow it down and find the story within the big picture here. One of the cases we did have, which kind of sticked out to us, was that they had this new project they were doing, and it was helping feed the cattle. And they said, well, we're going to show these landowners that you can plant these trees on your pastures, and the cows will eat the trees. And we're like, hang on a second, cows eating leaves off trees? Like, is that really happening? And they're like, oh, well, we've got research down south in other parts of South America that prove that these cows are eating off the trees. And we're like, oh, great, well, we'd love to see it so we can show it in our documentary. And they're like, well, we actually haven't put this into fruition yet. It's an idea, and we've just bought the trees, and they're all sitting in a bunch on the side of the mountain, but we haven't planted them yet, and there's no evidence. And we were like, well, hang on a second, we're trying to make a documentary here. We can't just put a bunch of facts on paper. So they were really pushing for this idea, and cows eating leaves off trees, and then they started talking about the Andean bears more. And we're like, well, hang on a second, these bears seem like a good sort of indicator species that we can latch onto and show. And they were like, oh, forget about the bears, we've talked enough about the bears, we've been doing the bears for 10, 15 years, we want to focus on the cows. So it's kind of this bears versus cows, and us as filmmakers trying to pull out the more intriguing story. We had this conflict with them. We kind of had to explain to them, like, look, it's not really feasible to do this cow story because you guys have no evidence yet, so we had nothing to film. So that being, one of the main problems we ran into with the storyboarding ideas, kind of trying to convince them that, we knew what we were doing and we had an idea in mind of how we wanted it to go. And yeah, it was kind of that funny cows versus bears dilemma going on there for a little while. Yeah, and then we started finding out a little bit more about the bears.
Yeah, so once, we were kind of pressing with them, like, oh yeah, so how about these bears? Like, how about the bears? And they kind of opened up a little more. We got to see some archival footage of these bears on camera. They have these motion cameras that they put in the forest, and every time something moves, it takes a photo. So in this archival footage, we saw like weird cats, some strange animals I can't name right now.
Yeah.
And these bears, which was really, really cool to see. And so we were trying to find a good way to get a character to push and kind of, like, we couldn't just focus on the bears. They're hard to get to and they're hard to see. They're so rare that we needed a character to take us that way. And there was this guy named Armando that we were particularly fond of. He was kind of an underdog in the company or the organization, and we needed him to show us the bears. So
Yeah, he was the main guy, right? He was the one going out there on horseback, traveling miles into the middle of the forest and set these cameras to do research on the bears. So once we kind of found him, he was a little camera shy, but we decided to latch onto him and keep him as a sort of story throughout the documentary that the audience could relate back to, because he had immense passion and just had a great story to tell.
And it was kind of awkward with the organization, them pushing this cow issue so hard, and we had to be like, well, we're actually going to focus on this little guy in your company and these bears that you didn't want us to do.
Yeah.
So it was definitely a challenge trying to make that okay, and we had to kind of assert ourselves, but they were fine with it in the end.
Okay, so yeah, once we got the storyboard down, we got our characters, we figured out what we wanted to focus on. It was time to start filming. There's a cool shot of me, the director, up there. I was cinematographer on the project, and Lisa was our editor. So Lisa actually stayed in Quaker at sort of HQ, we like to call it, and we relayed the footage back to her. We spent, it was a 2-hour drive out there, and you'll see in footage coming up, it's a bit of a treacherous one. But we basically went up there for a night and got all the footage that we could. Basically, my job was to represent these characters in the best light I could. So I was trying to show them, in the elements, in the rainforest, trying to get this big picture of this giant rainforest in the camera, which wasn't always the easiest thing to frame. And basically, that was the main thing. We're up there interviewing. We're up there showing Armando in the rainforest, setting cameras, setting up, walking around the forest. And my goal basically was to get enough footage and enough coverage of everything that we wanted to touch on in the documentary. So we have a clip here. It's pretty much the introduction of the documentary. You guys can get a feel for sort of what we came up with.
Cuando era niño era bastante cambiado, no es como ahora. El bosque era más deteriorado, más quemas, más talas. Mucha de las gente se dedicaban a lo que es cacería, lo que es tumbar la montaña para cultivos. Entonces le rompen la tierra con machetes, le cortan los árboles, prenden candela, se quema bastantes espacios. Bueno, yo llegué a ser guardaparque porque la Fundación Cordillera Tropical estaba involucrada en esto, que formó una microempresa. El trabajo era, bueno, al comienzo, cuando comenzó, era un poco complicado. Se hubo mucho más equipos, la gente también apoyaron en todo eso, entonces el trabajo fue muy específico, trabajamos muy bien y hubo buenos resultados. Mi sector favorito es mi lugar.
So editing a film in country was like nothing I've ever done. You can see me in hibernation mode over here. Spending hours and hours with the director and with our translators, just trying to figure out how this thing was going to come together. One of the things I started out with was a visual assembly, and that ended up being about 20 minutes roughly, maybe a little longer, but just kind of trying to compile everything Zane had given me into one documentary. So from there we just kept cutting it down. We had these storyboard walls, which was extremely helpful in that we could write out our basic timeline physically and have it rearrange it as much as we want, and then go back to the computer later and do what we thought was working on paper. So another issue was translating, because I do not speak Spanish. So working with long interviews of language that I have no idea what they are saying was extremely difficult. But luckily we had Professor DeMille on location with us, and he could help translate the entire interviews as much as possible.
And just to conclude, our research methods and stuff we think that you might be able to take in any research that you do is basically we got kind of 3 points here that we want to conclude on. Evidence, hypothetical versus proven. As I said, the whole cows bears dilemma, what can be proven and what's just an idea, and that's all that can go back to any sort of research you're doing in any project.
Another big point is passionate characters. If you do not have someone who your audience is going to like and drive the story, it's going to be dead heat. So we chose Armando because we thought he had that in him.
And yes, of course, selection and representation. Basically humanizing and connecting with the character. As a cinematographer, I had to choose how I wanted to shoot these characters, how I wanted to represent them, how the audience was going to view them, and then Lisa selected, what we were going to hear and what parts they were going to say. We had 30-minute interviews that we cut down to probably like 40 to 50-second sound bites. So that came down a lot to Lisa to decide, exactly what we wanted to have them saying in the documentary to represent them in the best light. And that can be taken back to any research, basically. It's how you want to represent your information you've gathered. And yeah, that'd be pretty much it.
Thank you.